Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce, and welcome to a bathrobe reading of a thread by Diana E. Anderson, who is responding to potential questions about this female researcher, or this professor, Jessica Krug, who it turned out had been faking being black. She's actually a Jewish woman from, like, the Midwest somewhere. So Jessica Krug came out and said, I'm not actually black, and that caused quite a stir. And then Diana E. Anderson wants to head off at the pass the questions around why one is able to switch genders, and that's acceptable to the progressive mindset, but it's not acceptable to switch races. So get your tea and your coffee and your tasty toaster biscuits and gather around. Let's read this thing. Diana E. Anderson wrote on September 3rd, 2020 at 11 a.m. So hey, with the new I'm a white woman pretending to be black thing, Google Jessica Krug, we're going to get another round of, if being transgender is okay, why can't you switch races? Question mark, question mark, question mark. Questions from ignorant whites. Let me try to answer that. Question mark. I love the ignorant whites. So filled with like reaching out and like sharing knowledge and understanding. Oh, that's what gets me, the sanctimoniousness. It's not that it's a religion. It's the sanctimoniousness that it as a religion promotes within its adherents. And you look at her, she's got this picture of herself as though she is a saint. And she's a former evangelical, current agnostic. Mom to Minerva and Nymphadora. All right. So Diana A. Anderson in this thread continues to write, it has to do with the different ways bodies are constructed in society and in our heads, and the ways our brains map onto these bodies. And then like a hand emoji, maybe like one of those cursor things, a Mickey Mouse hand. Trans people tend to experience forms of gender dysphoria. Their brains are built to map their bodies in a certain way. E.g., a trans man's brain will function as though the body has a penis when it doesn't, which can be very jarring. This is documented medical fact. One side note here, if you are ever writing things on the internet and you want to know whether to use EG or IE, I can't remember the Latin, but I do know that there's like this mnemonic trick for EG is the example given, and IE is in effect, i.e., in effect. So that's just a little, whenever I'm trying to compose something and I need to make that kind of transition in a sentence, that's how I remember whether to use EG to give an example or IE to kind of lay down in effect, to go into that thusly kind of like breakdown in the sentence. Diana E. Anderson continues to write, our relationship to our bodies is, in a lot of ways, rooted in what sexual organs we have. And even though gender is largely a social construct, largely, there's some margin of error there, largely a social construct, there's a root of reality in there that trans people experience as distress. So she is now possibly violating key tenet of queer theory by saying that there is a reality that it's based on. This might lead to trouble later on down, but she's rooting her explanation of why transgenderism is valid in some sort of, biological reality, which is dicey. She does, by the way, have a check mark, and I don't. I think I need to sign up through like a news organization to get a check mark on Twitter. I don't really want one, but I'm fast approaching more subs than most people with blue check marks, so it's kind of interesting to actually have more street cred than the official people. To continue, The same dysphoric reaction doesn't exist for people pretending to be a different race, because race isn't rooted in a physical reality in the way gender is. You also don't see these people who switch races using the same descriptions of dysphoria as many trans people do. Well, my first question is, how many people are actually switching races around here? You know what? I think there's probably a lot of people. I think that there might be developed some sort of DSM, like some sort of psychological complex or condition that kind of causes people to seek out the distress that is inherent in certain narratives within America and change their race in order to be a part of that narrative. Not to say that the narrative in and of itself is not real. It is rooted in historical reality, right? The experience of different races in America have different, inherited traumas to them, like inherited traumas. I'm not saying genetically inherited, but there's stories in there that are very, very powerful within the context of culture, within the context of presentation, within the context of academia, especially within the context of academia. And you could probably make an argument that this Kruger lady saw an opportunity to go up the ranks. I don't know. Maybe she saw an opportunity to become, black and then get a lot of cred that way. Or maybe she saw that she could get, victim cred through that. And I think that there might be some sort of underlying psychological condition that causes somebody to want to, be a part of that kind of cultural story. Now, the problem with race is that, or the ways in which race is developed, is that you can't opt into it. The same thing is on the other side is that the, and I mean this positively, I'm jibing them a little bit, even though sometimes they don't like to be jibed. The TERF position, the gender critical position, is that, you can't opt into the victimization or the oppression that women have faced throughout time. And there's a lot of documented oppression up to the present day, right? Depending on how you organize your facts. There's a lot of oppression there. A man can't opt into that oppression, but there's some sort of different cultural signifier there. And Diana E. Anderson's saying, so far, that it's rooted in our conception of the body. But I was just going to try to say, sorry, this is bathrobe reading, so we're still a little soupy here. How many people are actually opting into a different race? So do we actually have case studies for this stuff? There's 2 people so far that I know, but I bet there's a lot of people out there, especially in this coming generation where they were, the early 20-year-olds right now are being subjected to a lot of social pressure to identify as an ally or as, the victim within the Black Lives Matter, kind of madness that evangelical tip of that movement is searing into the neurons of young people right now, this kind of very racial hierarchy that is just organized according to oppression or believed oppression, projected oppression, and real oppression taken from the snapshots of life that they see through their little smartphones and perhaps woefully distorted view of history or not. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people trying to identify cross-racially in the coming years. So this is probably already outdated because transracialism is coming down the pipes. How can you stop it? This woman's trying to stop it in a heroic effort to keep race a sacred category and gender something that's malleable, right? To continue. It's very often that a person chooses to be perceived as a different race because they consider it advantageous for them to do so. White women pose as black women because they believe that identity affords them authority to speak on black issues that whiteness precludes. Note that Krug and Dolezal took on blackness in a very particular way. They took on the respectable black woman stereotype.
So sold my fucking neighborhood to developers and gentrifiers. So I got a couple of things to say. And when y'all come on and tell me my time stops, fuck out of here. It's been 7 hours. Not only did I have to listen to these cops, and not just the cops, but to be honest with y'all, city council members, you posing like you opposing them for your sound bites, for your social media, for your re-election campaigns. Fuck out of here. You've been supporting the cops in the pandemic when the MTA was strapped and you supported putting more cops on the MTA. Fuck out of here. We know where you're coming from, and we know what these little photo opportunity bullshits are. I also want to call out all these white New Yorkers who waited 4 hours with us to be able to speak and then did not yield their time to Black and brown indigenous New Yorkers who thought that their sense of, I thought cops was here to protect us, but I guess they're not. Boy, you think that this sort of like shock and empathy thing is the move. Okay, so a couple of things. You was talking about
It's important that both of these women are involved in academia. These women thought, I'd be able to speak better on this if I was Black. It's interesting. So instead of acknowledging that taking on Blackness was not their place, they instead fetishized and cannibalized Black womanhood for their own ends. Now, I wonder when she goes into the trans topic to define it, if it's all going to always be about gender dysphoria. And that in my trans adventures, there are people who have severe gender dysphoria. Then there's another set who are kind of opting in, especially males in their mid-40s. They have a particular way of opting into womanhood that has certain kind of sexual undertones, and not that sex in and of itself is negative, but it does kind of fuel them to assume, to appropriate the woman, to cannibalize femininity. And there's certain forms of transgenderism, like it's called autogynephilia, that can tend toward a kind of womanface, kind of appropriation of the woman. And then you see this on the internet, unfortunately, because I think that this is what is going to lead to the most amount of backlash towards trans people, is the very intense activist trans individuals, mostly male to female, being very decided in their ownership of woman. Like they define woman as something that they can define themselves into, and they kind of smash that category, and then they kind of reduce it into this pornified version of what they think the woman is. So they kind of almost take the oppression that they're putting on women in their brain and their fantasy of being a woman, that dehumanization, and then they assume it in this odd kind of self-cannibalization. And it's definitely a fetish, insofar as it is a fetish. But I'm just trying to say that there are different varieties of transition, or people who are put on the path, put themselves on the path of transition. Gender dysphoria is part of that, but as we'll probably see later, there's people who just want to be able to play around with gender and then tell women what to do, basically. To continue, whereas a trans person will frequently have an uneasiness and dysphoric experiences before they found the language to describe what they were. These women who became Black did so simply because they felt it advantageous to do so. Like I was saying, there's probably a lot of pressure, advantageous pressures, but there's probably like some sort of personality disorder that causes you to seek out oppression in a way and inhabit that oppression and then own that oppression and then speak from authority through that oppression. I think that, Robin DiAngelo is a case study in somebody who's assuming like this grand narrative of oppression and then channeling it through herself, in order to be the arbiter of, I want to say forgiveness, but there's no forgiveness in her theology. Krug, in particular, describes this with an awareness that she was deceiving people, as opposed to the transgender experience, where trans people experience fear because they are living their truth, but accused wrongly of deception. That is a tough nut to crack. If you honestly change your appearance to such an extent that you appear as the opposite sex, how much of that is deception? I mean, it literally is deception, insofar as you're sinking intentionality into your appearance in order to appear as something that you are not inherently, right? And the way in which you do that could be relying more or less on stereotypes or through surgery to sculpt your body in the way in which the other sex is sculpted. either hormonally with the hair or, hormonally with other growths or surgically with editing on that level. But it is a form of deception. And that's not necessarily, I'm not saying deception is always inherently wrong, but there is a deception going on. There's an illusion going on there. There's an assumption of another sex going on there. And I think I've tried to lay out that there are people who do that sincerely in order to avoid or mitigate distress internally. And then there's another set who, just want to assume and consume the woman. She's not making that distinction here, but it does exist. Oddly enough, she puts, because they're living their truth, but accused wrongly of deception. What does living your truth mean if you're denying biology? Well, she says that they're not denying biology, but living your truth to interact with the world as a woman when you're a man or as a black person when you're a white person are two different living their truths. And one, she's saying, is not deception. One is truthful and the other is not. So how are they different? She continues, the two experiences are so wildly different in how they manifest and how the individual views themselves and their relationships to society, that it is to compare apples to oranges. So she's saying that there's just a difference, but I don't really understand what the difference is yet. Addendum. To clarify what I mean by gender is rooted in physical reality. Looks like she got in trouble for that. By this, I simply was casting a large net, and that people will adjust their bodies in physical space to accord to their gender, often unconsciously, not that organs equal gender. Basically, it's a matter of epistemological and ontological ideas coming together. And that's a really thorny issue to split apart. This thread is meant to be just one angle that can answer for that issue. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done to make this clear. I don't think she actually made a point other than to say that they're two different things. And then she imposed, or she projected intentionality into the women, into Krug. She said Krug was just doing it for advantageous reasons, whereas people who switch gender never do it for unadvantageous reasons. You can't say that that's the case. So she made some sort of fallacy where she said that this person represents all these people and this idea represents all these other people. So she didn't actually make a point. It is a very fruitful argument and a question. If you can change your gender, why can't you change your age? If you can identify into another sex, why can't you identify into another identity? Why is sex the one that's malleable? Right? Why is sex the one that can move around? The other ones are more stable, more or less stable, right? Because I think that the narrative around race will break apart if you allow people to violate race. If you allow people to violate race, because race is such a encrusted topic. And furthermore, race is a very powerful subject, especially within academia, because academia is explicitly pursuing the equity agenda, which is to look at everybody according to their race and switch things, right? They did that with gender, but I think that they ran out of caring about trying to make women equal. They made women equal. If you look at colleges, there's more women in colleges than men, right? So women are more than equal, right? So the gender thing kind of lost steam. All those feminist studies, they had to turn into gender studies because they got what they wanted, right? And they can't just cry oppression constantly, so they have to kind of widen the net and turn it into gender studies, right? To get more people into there, right? To leech off of more oppression. If you allow people to violate race, when racism is used to cause the redistribution of wealth, right? When race is so important now because it's a pathway toward grants and towards special treatment, right? You get explicitly special treatment. And I know that there's a lot of negative treatment. Let's just say, for example, African Americans are, more likely to be, aggressed in certain ways in society. You can just say that, right? But within the bounds of the academy, they have the power to fire people. Some guy, some language professor, was put on administrative leave because he was expressing or showing how Chinese people use a certain form of or like every culture has that pause, that interjected vocalization within a sentence, Americans say a lot, or or right. And there is a word or sound or syllable that Chinese use that's close to the most egregious and evil word in the English lexicon, right? You can imagine what that is. It starts with N and ends with Iga. Right. And he was just, the professor was just explaining that, and somebody got super offended by that. Right. Because there's there's superpower for certain bodies to control the narrative. If you allow anybody to identify into that body, then that whole game of redistribution of power, or of claiming power that's not rooted in meritocracy, but rooted in identity, that whole thing falls apart. So you have to go around and you guard certain identities in order to facilitate the grand project of, equalizing some form of, or causing justice to happen in whatever way. So it's interesting that the transgender narrative and the transracial narrative are at odds for deep, kind of power reasons, right? And so it's kind of going to be interesting to watch people contort like she did. She didn't actually make a point, I don't think, other than project intentionality in order to facilitate, that cognitive dissonance. Like, well, we can change that, but we can't change this, right? And we can't actually say why we can't change this, and whereas we can change that, because that would give that would cause us to actually look at the fabric of our belief system, and why, even though we say that we want equality for all, we are actively trying to keep inequality active, because inequality, insofar as there's inequality, we have something to do with our lives, right? Which is to smash inequality. So there's like this self-preservation of anti-oppression. Within any form of anti-oppression, there's a self-preservation as a movement to keep oppression alive. But it's always variable. Anyway, so that was my bathroom reading for the week of September, the first week of September 2020. I hope you guys have a good weekend, as it is now nearly here upon us. I'll talk to you soon. Bye. Here you go.